Have you ever wondered how a composer's mind works? Well, today we have a special guest, composer Anthony Cheung, who's going to talk a little bit about how he thinks of creating new pieces of music, where his ideas and inspirations come from, and how he created his new piece for solo cello called Distance Over Speed. Anthony, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Chris.
The first thing I wanted to ask you, and what I was really curious to know more about, is just what is it like being a composer? Like, how do you create a new piece of music? Where do your ideas and inspirations come from?
Well, it's a great thing to be a composer because really all ideas are open to you. It's really your imagination is unrestrained, and you can choose to depict certain things in the world. You can write a piece about the ocean, you can write a piece about the sky, and all of those things can be translated or transcribed into sounds. On the other hand, you can also write purely abstract music where you might be dealing with certain kinds of forms or certain kinds of ways that instruments interact with each other. And I'm interested in all of those things. I don't particularly need to subscribe to any one way of thinking, and it really depends on the kind of project that I'm working with. But I love all kinds of ways of working.
Are there any ideas or inspirations that maybe recur in your music, or things that you're inspired by that, you know, kind of keep coming back to over time?
Yeah, I would say that, I don't write a lot of programmatic music, but I'm interested. A lot of music that I'm interested in. Programmatic music is music that is trying to depict certain things
or
in
like
the world.
Tell a story, or
Right.
like, you know, play out like what's happening with characters. Yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of the music that I love from the past is programmatic in nature, and I think somehow I'm drawn to that idea of narrative or of telling stories. So I try to do that, but in a more kind of generally atmospheric way.
So it's like you're telling a story with the notes and with the tones, rather than like actually telling a story with words or with characters.
Something more just purely evocative of a certain place.
Very cool. Let's talk about this piece that you wrote for solo cello called Distance Over Speed. Can you just talk about, like, well, what do those words mean to you, and how did you realize that with the cello?
So distance over speed, if you just look at those words, and you might think, well, are we saying that are we privileging distance over speed? Are we saying that distance is more important than speed? And that was one of, I like kind of play on word titles. And so that was kind of, you might think that's the original
that's
intent.
Like the original message, yeah. And when I heard that title for the first time, I thought those two words, like distance and speed, are very much related to just like how we move around in the world. Like we're always moving somewhere, and we move there in different speeds. Like if I'm walking across the room, or if I'm running to catch a train, or if I throw a ball across the room, or if I see a plane flying in the sky. Like we can always be moving somewhere, and the speed that we move at tells us a lot about what's going on in the world.
Exactly, and as you probably have studied in school, distance over speed is also an equation. It's the equation for time. So that was the kind of hint
sort of like a play on words, yeah. And we'll get to that equation in just a second, but let's just talk about and maybe hear some of the general sounds that you started with. So what were some of the first sounds that kind of came to mind when you started thinking about distance over speed?
So in thinking about distance on an instrument, if we were to think about that concept translated to your instrument, we'd be talking about interval distance, right?
So like the space between two notes.
Space between notes.
So like if I wanted to go from here, there's this distance, I don't know, maybe it's like an inch or something if I go between this note and that note.
Exactly.
But I could also go a much longer distance.
Exactly, yeah. So we can travel great distances on the same string at slow speeds, at fast speeds.
So I could do, let's see what that sounds like if I do a really fast one. Or I could go really slow.
what was that, like 10 seconds maybe?
Something like
something
that,
like
yeah.
that, but you only went just at a very short interval, right? So I was interested in those extremes
Sort of like the contrast between those two.
the contrast between distance and speed, and fast distance versus short speed, slow speeds, and vice versa, and all of those things.
Cool. So you mentioned that equation, distance over speed, and I was like thinking like, well, what does that actually mean for how it sounds? And I think it relates to this idea of contrasts.
Yeah.
So could you just take us through how that equation relates to how you created some of the sounds for this piece?
Yeah, so it's actually not meant to be taken so literally, the actual equation, but if we were to think about certain things, like if you were to travel a great distance on one of your strings, and let's say we play, that's the interval of a minor sixth.
And if we were to measure that with semitones or just little steps, there's actually 8 steps.
8 discrete
Yeah, so
steps.
there's like, we're talking about the space between the notes, not just the notes themselves. So there's 8 there.
Right. And so I actually, at certain points in the piece, explicitly tried to translate this idea. And so that specific interval, at one point during the piece, you have to play a figure where you go from the A to the F, which is the distance of 8 steps, in the course of 1 second.
Okay, so 8 steps, 1 second. So that might sound like this.
Right.
And in the piece, it sounds like this.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have the 8 steps in the 1 second. And then what's the contrasting example?
The contrasting example, which happens right after that, is to invert that relationship. So instead of the 8 steps in the 1 second, you have 1 step and 8 seconds.
Okay, so 1 step is a really small distance. And the way that you did it in the piece sounds like this. And I have to think really carefully about moving my fingers very slowly so that I just go a small distance over that long period of time. And you can hear they're so different.
Right.
One thing I was kind of curious about is because there's a lot of sliding or glissandos in this piece, like a lot of this kind of stuff. But in that case, you actually wrote kind of a little scale instead of just sliding. I'm just curious, like, why did you do that?
So that's where composition comes in. That's where we can make choices, and we can decide that we want certain scales and not other certain scales. I could have very easily just had you slide there. I could have very easily asked you to play all 8 steps, but I asked you to play not quite all 8, right? But almost all 8.
Yeah.
And not so evenly spaced, but irregularly spaced. And that's, as I said, it's a compositional choice. It's where I think you can create certain harmonies, certain melodies, and at that very moment, I felt that was the right choice.
And that's one of the cool things I think about composing, and what I hope everybody who watches this takes away from it, is that not only do you have an idea and like an inspiration, but then you also get to play around with that idea, and you don't have to follow it like to the word. You can kind of be creative and try different things, and then you kind of just you like it. You like the contrast. You like what you like, and you decided to do something a little bit different there that another composer might have done very differently. And that's kind of what makes this piece a piece by Anthony Cheung.
And the other thing that I did differently is in the contrasting portion, the very slow thing. You are also playing an open string, right? As you're doing that. So as the open string is being held as a reference point, then you're crossing from one to the next pitch, and you're hearing these slow increments get wider and wider as it's being played against the open string. Which
you start to hear these like kind of rough, bumpy noises, almost like. which in
Exactly.
music we sometimes call it beating.
Beating,
Yeah.
interference or beating, and that's when you have these very, very close intervals that start to interact with each other in interesting ways.
Yeah.
So that was another choice.
Yeah, and it's such a cool and evocative contrast that came from this very simple idea, but then the way that you add those little things like adding the open string or making the scale, that's really what makes it kind of a unique piece of music. So thank you, Anthony, so much for coming. We're going to now listen to a whole phrase of this piece, not the whole piece, but the last phrase of the piece, and see how all of this comes together. But I just want to thank Anthony again so much for being here and talking a little bit about what it's like to be a composer. Anthony, thank you.
Thank you so much.